Dr. John Snow from London. And again, a very, I would say, a popular anecdote is about how he was able to figure out what was causing the cholera epidemic and tied it to the source being certain water pumps that had polluted water. And the way he did it was essentially going around town, looking at where the cases were, plotting them on a map geographically, and also layering on different aspects of the geography, or in this case, utilities, which is water pumps, and figuring out that these cases are centered around those water pumps, meaning he was using real-world data to gather evidence that then supported a hypothesis. So as you can see here, it's both things mRNA were born out of the need of understanding the real world and what's happening in that world as it pertains to our interests. So if we now look at today what the kind of definition is, quote unquote, or how best we would describe real world evidence and market research, you see RWEs as, in a simple way, it's a bit simplistic, that it's the evidence that's obtained from real world data, meaning the observational data that is obtained from the context of outside randomized controlled trials, because RCTs are by nature controlled experiments. And what happens once something that is used outside of a controlled experiment, you can only know it well when you observe it in that context. And that's the main objective of RWE. Whereas market research is there to obtain information about customers' need. Again, going back to its source, to marketing. Here we're trying to understand the customers' needs, their preferences, their decision drivers and barriers that then impact their decision to either purchase something or not purchase something. But if you take a step back and look at, what exactly are these two things really different? Are they two different tools in a toolkit, or can they be kind of combined to be a super tool of some sorts? I think you need to step back and look at the bigger context of what we're trying to understand here as it pertains to us in the pharma industry. What we are most interested in are clinical and market outcomes, right? That's what all we're trying to do. The commercial functions and market access and market research, all of us are essentially trying to predict and understand what the clinical and market outcomes would be. But how do we arrive at them? Where do you start predicting these outcomes, or how are these outcomes derived from? What are they derived from? At the very base, obviously, it's the data from the RCTs, right? That's the basis of approval. That's what physicians would first look at to make any kind of decisions for any new products. But again, they are controlled experiments. They are designed to be fair, to control for confounding factors and biases, which, by the way, are there always present in the real world. So you're taking those out when you're conducting these RCTs. So you have to kind of factor that back in. What's the influence of these real world factors? And it can take multiple forms. So it can be the prior knowledge of a physician, which contributes their biases. It could be the patient's voice, what they want. Then there are a lot of logistical factors, like availability, compliance, et cetera. Then you have to factor in the economics of it. And last but not least, of course, there's promotional activity happening and how that's influencing the outcomes. So all of this kind of ladders up to get to the clinical and market outcomes that we are trying to predict, right? And that's where market research and RWE both come in and help us study and understand these real-world influences, which can then help us predict and tell us how we could influence potentially the clinical and market outcomes. So with that, the next part we'll go and look at how market research and RWEs are similar and where they differ from each other.
Yeah, so we've kind of we're trying to establish that market research and RWE are more or less two sides of the same coin. And on the path of establishing that, we've seen that RWE and MR have common origins. They have common themes. And if we see where did RWE start and MR start, as Vin pointed out, they were essentially surveys. So John Snow went around conducting surveys. Daniel Starch went around conducting surveys. So it was essentially surveys, primary surveys, door-to-door recruitment, pen and paper essentially. But it has evolved on both sides, and the evolution also is more or less similar when it comes to market research and RWE. So it has gone beyond primary in both cases. We are looking at a variety of data collection methods. We are looking at use of different types of data sources, the use of big data analytics within both MR and RWE that's emerging. Again, on the data management and analysis side, we started off with short, focused questionnaires, some basic statistics, and reporting was mainly done through charts, through tables, graphs, and the ethics and governance practically didn't exist at the time. But as it has evolved, we are seeing a much more complex data management happening, use of analytics platforms, both in MR and RWE, use of AI and machine learning is now seeping into both of these areas. There are complex visualization tools that are being used, and there are national or international data standards and governance and guidelines that inform both MR and RWE. So there are a lot of commonalities in the way they have originated and the way that they have evolved. Now coming to what types of studies do we do in MR as well as RWE? So essentially, there are two types of studies, descriptive and analytical, or explanatory. And in both cases, we are essentially doing these type of studies. In MR, we are describing consumers, prescribers, the market, the media mix, the communications, and so on. Whereas in RWE, we are describing populations, the disease, health states, practices, outcomes. And we are looking at the interplay and the relationships between these on the analytical part. Looking at campaign effectiveness, for example, on the MR side, or preference assessments. On the RWE side, we may be looking at clinical effectiveness or cost effectiveness and safety. So we've seen that there are some similarities, but the types of data that get used in MR and RWE could be a bit different, although they can be kind of slotted into some similar categories. So at a population level, the most basic tool or the most important and basic tool that market researchers use would be a census. Similarly, on the RWE side, there are national or large healthcare databases that are used. There could be specific purpose databases. For example, within MR, there is a lot a use of sales data, prescription data, health and wellness survey data, and on the RWE side, we're looking at claims or EHR, EMR data. We could be using registries or patient panels, patient communities in MR, again, these could be used interchangeably as well. Primary, of course, but methods of recruitment may vary. And primary in RWE would be mainly, looking at chart reviews or bespoke surveys and focus groups, whereas bespoke surveys, interviews, and focus groups also happen in MR. And of course, emerging use of social media. That is a common theme in both areas. So now, we've kind of established MR and RWE are more or less, similar. They have similar origins, similar methods. Let's do a show of hands on this slide. I'll bring up some examples, and let's do a show of hands and see what the audience thinks. Is this MR or RWE? So this is a study that was published looking at to study the impact of dementia-related behavioral symptoms on health resource use. Real-world data from Europe and United States. People who think this is real-world data, show of hands, please. MR? One hand there. All right. So, yes, it was positioned as a real-world evidence study, but then the methods that were used, the data collection was undertaken in line with European Pharmaceutical Marketing Research Association guidelines. Right? So, it is an MR study, which is being positioned as real-world evidence. Right? Let's look at this one. Online survey of clinical practice in patients with schizophrenia treated with long-acting injectable. RWE, anyone? Market research, anyone? Okay, no hands on RWE, a few hands on market research. So the objective of the study was to obtain real-world evidence of functional improvement using an online survey. Perceived unmet needs in patients with advanced bladder cancer and their caregivers. MR, anyone? Okay. RWE, anyone? One of the keywords on the article was real-world evidence. COVID-19 sentiment analysis using college subreddit data. RWE, anyone? Feels tempting to raise your hand on RWE, isn't it? MR? Okay. Our study contributes to the growing real-world evidence in the area. So, you see that there is a lot of interchangeability. The way MR methods are being adopted and used in RWE and vice versa, the lines are getting blurred as to what is MR and what is RWE. Then why do we have separate teams, separate departments, separate people working on these things? Anyways, we'll come to that, but here's another example of a study where there was a claims data analysis, and that was combined with a qualitative survey. So this is a combination of RWE and MR used in the same study. So we are seeing the lines between MR and RWE getting blurred, but then there are use cases that are pure RWE or pure MR use cases, and through the life cycle. But then there are commonalities between the two. There are areas of synergies where these lines get blurred, and market researchers are contributing to the area of real-world evidence, and real-world evidence observational researchers are contributing to market research there as well. So these areas of synergy could be things like opportunity assessments, where claims data are being used as well. Market researchers are doing it with surveys and so on. In this room, I've spoken to a few people who are using claims data already. And that's prevalent in the US, may not be so prevalent in Europe because of data privacy laws, but that is happening already. Things like patterns of use, treatment journey, patient journeys, patient voice, segmentation of populations, use and preference assessments. Post-approval commitments, risk management plans. I have looked at risk management plans of products, and there are invariably, a lot of these risk management plans contain surveys of doctors around, how they are being educated on prescription of the drug, what steps are they supposed to do to test that they're giving it to the right population, and how effective these campaigns are. So these are being incorporated in risk management plans that are being submitted to the EMA or to the FDA. here in this case had an asset for second-line treatment of an early-stage bladder cancer. And the development program comprised of a single-arm pivotal phase 2. An external control arm was deemed not necessary by the US FDA or the EMA, but it was felt, there was feedback from payers that they might want to see some controls. So there was a need to put some external control arm data in place. But there was a problem, and the problem was that if we were to study this from an RWE perspective, the disease did not have an ICD code. The disease definition was not standardized. Physicians had different views on what the disease is. The adherence to treatment guidelines was as low as 25%. So, there was a lot of heterogeneity in the way that the disease was being treated by physicians in different countries. And there was a lot of use of off-label treatments that was happening in the real world. So in that case, how do you kind of go about doing an external control arm where it's a free-for-all, almost a free-for-all in the market? And in the external control arm, you would have to have very, very stringent protocols about what kind of patients you include. So are you introducing a biased patient population when you kind of align it with the population that is in the clinical trial? That was a challenge that we were facing. We looked at a few potential solutions. We looked at an RWE only solution, analysis of EHRs or charts to understand treatment patterns and select out relevant populations. We looked at an MR only solution wherein we were doing physician and potentially patient surveys as well as focus groups to understand which patients were being channeled to what kind of treatments. And then thereby inform the recruitment on the external control arm. But then both of these methods had their drawbacks. There were problems with both of these methods. So the ideal method, or in this situation there was no ideal method actually, but the most suitable method combined both of these approaches. And finally we were able to kind of design an external control arm for the client. Another example was, in this case, the client was interested in generating evidence on the longitudinal evolution of the impact of cognitive impairment in a patient population, but the impact, the economic impact that was to be studied was on the caregivers. So what is the economic impact on the caregivers when they have to give up their careers, they have to, their productivity suffers, the productivity of their employer suffers, and so on. So, it was data that you will not really get in medical charts, and this was to be stratified by the severity of cognitive impairment. So in this case, one of the biggest challenges we faced was that confirmed diagnosis and testing of cognitive impairment was not happening in the real world in a very systematic way. And productivity data of caregivers was something that was not available readily. So there could have been, in this case, an MR-only approach where we could have conducted some surveys with patients and their caregivers, as well as connected that back to the patients using patient report forms through physicians. And linking up the data, we could have had some data about small samples about having the productivity burden for those caregivers. We could have done an analysis of EHRs, but productivity of caregivers was not. We could not link to that in the situation. So what did we end up with? We ended up with a solution which was using real-world evidence techniques, but on a data set that's run by the University of Michigan. They do waves of, annual waves of surveys of the adult population in the US. And it's called the Health and Retirement Study. And the Health and Retirement Study overall had about 22,000 patients of cognitive impairment over all of these waves. And this cross-sectional data could be converted into longitudinal data and analyzed. And the study also had information about the cognitive impairment levels. MMSE scores were there. The study also had information about caregiver, income levels and income details over time. So that's a study that we could use, combining a traditional market research type of data set or a survey data set, but applying real-world evidence methods on it. With that, I'll pass it over to Vin.
Thank you, Sumit. So I'm going to just quickly try and wrap things up here and focus on what does this mean for us as market researchers when we look ahead to maybe try and work more together with the real-world evidence side of things. Just to put it into context, if you look at the history, we began from a phase in early 20th century before that, where it was completely physician-centric medicine. Every physician practiced the way they wanted. There were no established standards, publications, etc., to an era which was dominated by highly standardized practice of medicine, guided by randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews, to now something starting in the 90s and continuing on, which is adding back the personalized part of things, like the expert opinions, the patient's voice, and moving to a more patient-centric model that's going more and more towards in the direction of customized care and precision medicine. So what does this mean for the future? I'm just going to skip a couple of slides in the interest of time, but I do want to speak about what does this mean for the future. So just a few examples which I think illustrate this point, right? Let's take patient-reported outcomes. The importance of that is growing day by day in gaining approvals and seeking reimbursement, and then also in marketing. But so far, real-world evidence has always been the tool that's used to study PROs. But have we really done that much of research to understand how these PROs actually, what do they mean for the patients? How do they really represent what the patients want, or are they just metrics that are easier to measure in a clinical trial setting, and that's why we're using them at PROs? Maybe that's a question for market research. If you look at the growing importance of pharmacoeconomics, it's something that HEOR focuses on, but mainly from the reimbursement perspective, right? But there hasn't been that much emphasis on research or market research in understanding what these economics trade-offs are and what they mean for a patient and physician when making treatment decisions. Advent of gene therapy and precision medicine is also forcing more and more us more and more towards the point where the understanding of these minute real-world factors into clinical decisions becomes kind of inseparable from the overall clinical decision making, and hence has to be studied in both the RWE and market research context. And how can we forget big data and AI? I'm sure all of you have heard of ChatGPT, and there might be soon a time when patients are interacting with a chatbot when getting at least routine care, if not something that's specialized. What does that mean for market research? Or do we need to rethink the qual and quant techniques that we've been using so far? Would they kind of become obsolete almost overnight? And how can RWE then step in, or rather the principles and tools that RWE uses step in there to help us get market research or get what we need out of market research in a setting where our respondents are not really actual human beings, right? So summarize and cap it all, I just wanted to lay in front of you all a few questions to take away as considerations as you go back to your regular market research stuff. When you're designing studies, can we try and think about how a particular market research study may benefit from prior assessment of the market using real-world data sources. Can a particular MR study be made more robust by adding in real-world data to it, as illustrated in some of the examples that Sumit just mentioned? And we also need to develop our understanding of what are real-world data sources, how can they be obtained, and how can they best be used. And last but not least, of course, we have to be more collaborative. There are people doing RWE, they are sitting in different functions. Can there be more cross-functional, cross-talk, and collaboration such that we can weave in any kind of RWE plans into our annual market research plans? So that's the end of a prepared talk. We're happy to take any questions, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Really helpful presentation. I'm struggling to, for myself, understand where that line really is between what you're classifying, and we all classify as real-world evidence, and market research. And in your case studies, what I observed is it was fairly clean. So if it was observational data, I think we were tending to call that real-world evidence. And once you layered on a survey, we're calling that market research or primary market research.
Yes.
But in the beginning of the presentation, that clean line wasn't there. So what I was seeing in the beginning is if the publisher is calling it real-world evidence, you're kind of calling it real-world evidence. And it's important for those of us that work in fairly conservative organizations. I lead a global market research and forecasting function for a German pharmaceutical company. So we tend to have a lot of rules, internal rules, and that slows us down. And we have this debate and this conversation very often on what is truly a market research project and should go through our market research review processes, and what is considered to be either a general medical study, a real-world evidence study, and then we have different protocols and we have different review processes. Where we've tended to land is if the study does not have an official protocol review, and it has a survey, and we're speaking with patients or physicians, we generally call that market research because we don't call it anything else. And it doesn't have another review that happens internally with compliance or a medical board. But I was just really struck by the difference in the beginning of your presentation, and then when we got to the case studies, it was very black and white. So I'd love to hear more on your perspective on where that line really is.
Well, the line is increasingly getting blurred. So there is a line that gets created, and as you pointed out, some of these artificial lines that get created based on processes. For example, if there's a protocol, it is real-world evidence. If not, it is MR, right? So what stops us from having a protocol for MR projects? Or the other way around, what stops us from doing a more exploratory project in real-world evidence rather than have a very, very stringent protocol, right? So it's these internal processes that kind of make it clear, rather, clarify it a bit for functions within the company. But then as we see the outputs in the real world, the outputs that are really getting published or are being the case studies that get churned out, the lines are pretty much blurred. So it's from what we've seen, it's about documentation. So the documentation is very stringent within the real world evidence teams right now, whereas within market research it is not. But it is not something that, for example, if I have to do that subreddit data study, I can do it as an exploratory data mining study, or I can have a very stringent protocol, hypothesis around what I'm looking for, and do it. It's just the way I do it. But does that mean it gets classified as real-world evidence or MR? I don't think that is the case. I think the lines are blurred.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I understand that that's how the systems are set up right now, because as we illustrated, MR and RWE have different origins or At least one was focused on marketing research, other was focused on public health. But as in today's world, that line itself is getting blurred, because when we are trying to do marketing focused research or market research to guide commercial decisions, it's increasingly clear that we cannot leave out the pure health aspect of it, what the patients see as the value and the physicians see as value, right? So at some point we have to start, as Sumit was saying, breaking down those internal barriers, and that's kind of the concept that we're presenting. Practically, yes, there's a long way to go to get there, but I think we need to get to finally a stage where we don't think about those two things, market research, which is done by collecting data in a primary manner from specific people, versus using data that's already been generated and is sitting there. Why don't we get to a stage where we can always use both of those together to get to our final objective? And I completely agree that there are institutional barriers at this time that prevent that kind of cross-thinking. Not in all companies, not in all functions, but sometimes, or rather many places that happens.